They're getting easier to work with.
This wonderful, beautiful weather that wants us to go out and enjoy it.
Good morning, everyone.
Your daughter-in-law.
Well, you are in the class about Israel. And before I forget, next week we will not be meeting in here. This next Saturday is going to be the Ladies' Day here. And the ladies are going to have their own class on Sunday morning in here. So everybody, all us guys, will be probably going into the auditorium for that class. So no class, no Israel class in here next week. Okay. We are discussing the story of Israel, how it was God had moved them out of Egypt. He had given them the promised land. Each tribe got their own territory. Life was good. He gave them a king, which he said that they should not have, but they insisted on getting a king. And so the first king was Saul, the second king was David, and the third king was Solomon. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that a little bit later, but I wanted to follow up with some quick discussions we had last week, trying to take a look at the Middle East then and some things that are going on now. And if you remember, we talked about the building of the temple. And Solomon entered into an agreement with Hiram from Tyre. Tyre is in Lebanon. And he asked Tyre to send him someone to oversee this major project. They floated all of these cedar logs, floated them some 95 miles from Tyre down to Jerusalem, and then hauled them overland. We talked a little bit about that, but the reason we talked about that was, so what does that mean? Here is Lebanon today, and this is Israel. Here is, obviously you've been hearing a lot about Gaza. Here is Jerusalem. But the reason it's in the news today is this last week, Israel has started launching missiles into Lebanon. And it just so happens that it's in the area of Tyre where they cut all of those cedars and sent them down. And if you've been following this very closely, the terrorist group that's in Lebanon is called Hezbollah. And so Israel's been trying to attack Hezbollah in Lebanon. And now Lebanon has, I just read yesterday that they had launched a missile back at Jerusalem. So there's a great deal of conflict going on in this area where Solomon was working with King Hiram from Tyre to help build the temple. So I just wanted to kind of give you a brief picture of what's going on over there now. So kind of recap where we were last week. We talked about the grand and glorious temple that Solomon built. It was designed and planned and all of the supplies gathered by David. But God told David, you're not going to be the one to build the temple because you are a man of war. Your son will build the temple. So it took him 7 years to build it. It was a magnificent edifice. And it's known as the first temple. And then we find out, we're going to be talking more about this next week, but the temple is destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC. And then it was rebuilt when the Israelites came back out of captivity. They came back to rebuild that, so that is known as the second temple. Sometimes it's referred to as Zerubbabel's temple because Zerubbabel was one of the leaders who started the reconstruction work. And that temple was completed and it was dedicated in 516 BC. But then when we move into the New Testament, in the first century, Herod, trying to placate the Jews, they were longing for this temple, so he started expanding on the second temple. It's known as Herod's temple, And we looked at some passages. There's 3 passages in Matthew, Mark, and Luke where the disciples are with Jesus and they're looking at the temple, and apparently this temple that Herod had rebuilt was a magnificent, glorious edifice. And the disciples said, "Have you ever seen anything like this? This is a glorious building." And Jesus said, "Well, I'm telling you today that it won't be long and that temple is going to be destroyed." He said, "Not one stone will be left on another." And that's Herod's temple. So the other thing we talked about last week, so that's known as the Second Temple or Herod's Temple. But I talked to you about there are groups now, both Christians and Jews, who are expecting the temple to be rebuilt again. So there's a group of Jewish Orthodox Jews who are already gathering supplies and materials. I showed you a couple pictures of the menorah that they've already built, that they hope that plan to go into the new temple when it's rebuilt. But there's also a group of Christians that believe that the temple will be rebuilt again, and that Jesus will actually reign from Jerusalem from there. And I don't know where you are on your end times philosophy and thinking, but there are groups that are expecting that temple to be rebuilt. The Jewish people even have selected people that they believe are from the tribe of Levi, and training them to be priests to do all of the things that will be done in this new temple. I think they meet twice a year to practice all of the ceremonies that will be conducted in the new temple. So there, but here is a picture of just what Jesus said was going to happen. He said that no stone will be left upon another, and this occurred in 70 A.D. Do you know who destroyed the temple or in 70 A.D.? It was the Romans. The Romans. When you get into the New Testament and study New Testament history, you find out that there was a rebellion by the Jews in Jerusalem and actually surrounding country. They did not like all of the strong oversight by the Romans, so they started to rebel. And Rome said, "Well, we're not going to deal with that." So they came in, attacked Jerusalem. A lot of this is recorded in the writings of Josephus, and the things that went on there were just tragic. And as we'll talk a little bit about this more when we get into our next lesson, the way that countries attacked then was they laid what they call lay siege to the location. That means they surrounded it, essentially starved everybody to death. So this is what happens in 70 A.D., and that's when all of these stones came tumbling down just as Jesus predicted. Okay, I gave you some homework. Did anybody read your homework? Oh, Anita did, yeah, because she asked me questions.
Get away with it.
And I had to tell her I don't know. But so anyway, we're going to do right now. This is a glorious time for the Jews. Again, going back over it, they've been in captivity. Now they have their own nation. They have their own king. And the king has built them this beautiful, beautiful temple. So they are at the peak of their life, really, all of the Jews. Over all this period of time, 400 and some years now, they live in a place they like. They have a place to worship. And then we talked about this. What happens is God had told Solomon, said, "I don't want you marrying women outside the Jewish nation. Do not marry women from other nations." And we know that's what he did. So Solomon now is going to really lead to the downfall of the nation of Israel. So we're going to start reading in 1 Kings chapter 11. I don't know if we'll get through all of this today, but we'll go as far as we can. 1 Kings chapter 11, beginning in verse 7. So now Solomon, and if you look back at verse 6, Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely as David his father had done. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. He did the same for all his foreign wives who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. The Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. So the Lord said to Solomon, "Since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Nevertheless, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. Yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but will give him one tribe for the sake of David my servant and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen." I've always been struck by that passage of God trying to be patient with Solomon, and he said, well, if that's your attitude, then here's what's going to happen. Have you ever said that to one of your teenagers? Huh? If that's your attitude, well, this is what God is doing to Solomon here. So we're going to see now that Solomon's attitude leads to the fall of the kingdom. So now let's stay that same chapter. We're going to jump over to verse 26 through 43. Now there are two names here we're going to actually three things in here I want to point out. One is the name Rehoboam, Jeroboam, and Ahijah. So before we get into this, Jeroboam is going to end up leading one of the nations and Rehoboam the other. Rehoboam is the son of Solomon. Jeroboam is just a worker for Solomon. So Rehoboam is the son. It's the only name, Solomon's only son that's mentioned in the Bible is Rehoboam. Now the name Ahijah, we're going to read here in a minute. It's called the prophet Ahijah, and he's only mentioned twice. We don't know much about him, but we're going to read where God is using a prophet that we don't know much about to take this message. So in verse 26, also Jeroboam, son of Nebat, rebelled against the king. He was one of Solomon's officials, an Ephraimite from Zeradah, and his mother was a widow named Zeruiah. Here is the account of how he rebelled against the king. Solomon had built the supporting terraces and had filled in the gap in the wall of the city of David his father. Now Jeroboam was a man of standing, and when Solomon saw how well the young man did his work, he put him in charge of the whole labor force of the house of Joseph. About that time, Jeroboam was going out of Jerusalem, and Ahijah, the prophet of Shiloh, met him on the way, wearing a new cloak. The two of them were alone out in the country, and Ahijah took hold of the new cloak he was wearing and tore it into 12 pieces. Then he said to Jeroboam, "Take 10 pieces for yourself, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. See, I'm going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes. But for the sake of my servant David and the city of Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, he will have one tribe. I will do this because they have forsaken me and worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Molech, the god of the Ammonites, and have not walked in my ways, nor done what is right in my eyes, nor kept my statutes and laws as David his father did. But I will not take the whole kingdom out of Solomon's hand. I have made him ruler all the days of his life for the sake of David my servant, whom I chose and observed my commands and statutes. I will take the kingdom from his son's hands and give you 10 tribes. I will give one tribe to his son, so that David my servant may always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem, the city where I chose to put my name. However, as for you, I will take you, and you will rule over all that your heart desires. You will be the king over Israel." So here's what God is saying. He's saying, Jeroboam, you're now going to be made king of Israel. and you're going to have 10 tribes. If you do whatever I command you and walk in my ways and do what is right in my eyes by keeping my statutes and command, as David my servant did, I will be with you. I will build you a dynasty as enduring as the one I built for David, and will give Israel to you. I will humble David's descendants because of this, but not forever. As for the other events of Solomon's reign, all he did and the wisdom he displayed, are they not written in the book of the annals of Solomon? Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over Israel for 40 years. Then he rested with his father and was buried in the city of David his father, and Rehoboam his son succeeded him as king. When you read through the Old Testament prophets, you'll see this term, are they not written in the book of the annals? So this is essentially historical records that the kings kept. So they kept records of everything that went on in their kingdom. So there's a lot of other things that occurred that we do not have in Scripture, but what were recorded in the annals of the king. Sometimes it's the annals of Solomon. You'll see this term throughout the Old Testament for various kings. Other things are recorded in the annals. Those are essentially, if you will, the journal of those kings. Again, Rehoboam is the only son, and so he's the only son named in Scripture. Now I want to jump over to 12, and we're going to read verse 5 through 24. Actually, I'm going to start in verse 1 so we get the background. So now Rehoboam is in charge. So Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all the Israelites had gone there to make him king. When Jeroboam, son of Nebat, heard this, he was still in Egypt, where he had fled from King Solomon. If you read further, you'll find that Jeroboam's afraid that Solomon's coming after him, so he goes to Egypt. But he returned from Egypt. So they sent for Jeroboam, and he and the whole assembly of Israel went to Rehoboam and said to him, "Your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you." So Jeroboam is going back, since Rehoboam is really succeeding Solomon. If you remember, we talked about how did Solomon support his lavish lifestyle. Do you remember how they did that? He asked each of the administrative areas, there were 12 of them, each one of you is to supply the needs of my household for 1 month a year. And so that's what he asked for. But he had such a lavish lifestyle. Not only they supplied, and we were in one of our earlier lessons, we talked about here was what he needed. And it was a massive amount of livestock and gold and so forth to support Solomon's lifestyle. And additional taxes, which is exactly what Samuel said was going to happen. When they asked for a king, he said, well, you get a king, but here's what's going to happen. The king is going to take your sons and daughters, he's going to send them in the battle, and he's going to put a heavy burden on you. And so now then that we've got this breakup, Jeroboam goes and says, Rehoboam, your father really put a heavy burden on us, and it's more than we can handle. Can you do something about it? So here's what happens. Interesting story. In verse 5, Rehoboam answered, you go away for 3 days, then come back to me. So the people went away. He says, I'll get back to you on that. So then King Rehoboam consulted the elders who had served his father Solomon during his lifetime. How would you advise me to answer these people, he asked. They replied, if today you will be a servant to these people and serve them and give them a favorable answer, they will always be your servant. But Rehoboam rejected the advice the elders gave him and consulted the young men who'd grown up with him and were serving him. He asked them, well, what is your advice? How should we answer these people who say to me, lighten the yoke your father put on us? The young men who'd grown up with him replied, tell these people who've said to you, your father put a heavy yoke on us, but make our yoke lighter. You tell them, my little finger is thicker than my father's waist. My father laid on you a heavy yoke. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions. 3 days later, Jeroboam and all the people returned to Rehoboam as the king had said, "Come back to me in 3 days." The king answered the people harshly, rejecting the advice given him by the elders. He followed the advice of the young men and said, "My father made your heavy yoke, I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips, and I will scourge you with scorpions." So the king did not listen to the people, for this turn of events was from the Lord, to fulfill the word the Lord had spoken to Jeroboam, son of Nebat, through Ahijah the Shilonite. So, when all of Israel saw that the king refused to listen to them, they answered the king, "What share do we have in David? What part in Jesse's son? To our tents, O Israel, look after your own house." So, this lavish lifestyle of Solomon's now is having a trickle-down effect. People said, "Rehoboam, can you give us some relief?" He said, "You think that was tough? Wait and see what I do." So he puts a heavier burden. He puts a heavier burden on the people than even Solomon had. How do you think is that a good way to start a kingdom? I don't think so. So 1 Kings 12:20. So when all the Israelites heard that Jeroboam had returned, they sent and called him to the assembly and made him king over all of Israel. Only the tribe of Judah remained loyal to the house of David. So now we end up with this division of what's happened here. So, as I said, this was the golden age. Because of Solomon's conduct, God takes the kingdom away. And then we end up down here, Rehoboam offers no relief, is going to make it even worse. So they say, we want Jeroboam to be our king, not Rehoboam. So now then we have this division. And the northern kingdom is divided. There's 10 tribes to Jeroboam and 2 tribes to Rehoboam. Now that's an interesting things here. If you go through and look at all of this, it seems as though the numbers don't add up. He says there's going to be 10 to the north and 1 tribe to the south. So that's 11. But there are 12 tribes. So the question is, how does that add up? There's lots of speculation about it. The southern kingdom, I'm going to show you some charts in a minute. Southern kingdom is actually going to end up with, looks like 3 tribes. The one, as some say, well, it's because Levi is not counted. Do you remember what was unique about the tribe of Levi?
They were the priests.
They were the priests. And when God gave them the promised land, he allowed everybody to take a territory except Levi. Levi, they were given cities. So they did not have a piece of their own territory. So they are not, some people say they're not counted in here. So I'm going to show you another chart here in a minute, but this is the chart of the United Kingdom. And if you look real closely, you can see some different dashed lines. And one of them says David's kingdom, Solomon's kingdom. It's because as each king succeeded, they actually ended up taking more territory. So the kingdom continued to grow. So this is what it looked like as a united kingdom. Over here's another picture of something similar. This is the United Kingdom. Here's what it looks like when it's divided. So down in the yellow part is the tribe of Judah. And it's called Judah. It was the largest tribe. Do you remember what was important about the tribe of Judah? Why is that significant?
When David was there, that's where Jesus came out of, the tribe of Judah. The line of Judah.
It's through Judah. You read this in the New Testament. David was of the tribe of Judah, and God had promised that if they would remain faithful, that there would always be a king coming from David in the southern kingdom. So the tribe of Judah was extremely important. So some people just always refer, in fact, it'll be known as Judah, and this will be known as Israel. As you read further along, you will actually see they'll be referring to this nation down here also as Israel. So I just wanted to show this to you. They've divided the kingdom now, and the thing that is so important here. Why is this important? Does geography make any difference at all?
It's where they built the temple, isn't it?
That's where they built the temple. We'll talk about that in just a second. So if you take a look at how this is divided, Southern Kingdom is 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin. Levi is questionable. We find out that some from Levi actually migrated down here, so the tribe of Levi is just kind of in different places. And these are the 10 northern tribes. So now this great kingdom that Solomon had helped build now is falling apart. So what we end up with, in the northern kingdom, the capital becomes Samaria. In the southern kingdom, the capital is Jerusalem. So over here, this northern kingdom goes by Israel, but sometimes it's called Ephraim. So just try to keep track of that as we move forward. This is what happened is Jeroboam now is going to set up some new religions in Israel. And the reason being, let me see, I think we're going to read that passage. Let's go to 1 Kings 12. And I want to read 25 through 33. So the problem here is this. Jerusalem is in the southern kingdom, and that's where God wanted his people to worship. So now then, the northern kingdom doesn't have access. So here's where we get in chapter 12, verse 25. Then Jeroboam fortified Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and lived there. From there he went out and built up Peniel. Jeroboam thought to himself, the kingdom will now likely revert to the house of David if these people go up to offer sacrifices at the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem. They will again give their allegiance to their lord Rehoboam, king of Judah. They will kill me and return to King Rehoboam. After seeking advice, the king made 2 golden calves. He said to the people, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. One he set up in Bethel, and the other in Dan, and this thing became a sin. The people went even as far as Dan to worship the one there. Jeroboam built shrines on high places and appointed priests from all sorts of people, even though they were not Levites. He instituted a festival on the 15th day of the 8th month, like the festival held in Judah, and offered sacrifices on the altar. This he did in Bethel, sacrificing to the calves he had made. And at Bethel he also installed priests at the high places he had made. On the 15th day of each of the 8th month, a month of his own choosing, he offered sacrifices on the altar he had built at Bethel. So he instituted the festival for the Israelites and went up to the altar to make offerings. Just keep your finger there. I want you to turn back to Deuteronomy, and we'll see why this is important. So, God wanted his people to worship in one place, not lots of different places. So let's read here beginning in verse 8 of chapter 12 of Deuteronomy. You are not to do as we do here today, everyone as he sees fit, since you have not yet reached the resting place and the inheritance the Lord your God is giving you. But you will cross the Jordan and settle in the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, and he will give you rest from all your enemies around you so that you will live in safety. Then to the place the Lord your God will choose as a dwelling place for his name, there you are to bring everything I command you, your burnt offerings and sacrifices, your tithes, special gifts, and all the choices you have vowed to the Lord. And there rejoice before the Lord your God and your sons and daughters, your men servants and maidservants, and the Levites from your towns who have no allotment or inheritance of their own. Be careful not to sacrifice your burnt offerings anywhere you please. Offer them only at the place the Lord will choose in one of your tribes, and there observe everything I command you. So, in going back in the history of the Jewish nation, God says, I want you worshiping in one place. And here he says, it's going to be a place that I choose. So, where is that?
Jerusalem.
It's Jerusalem. That's the reason God has allowed Solomon to build this great temple. And you remember we talked last week, once he built the temple, as it proceeded, God's being, his presence, came and sat in that temple. So as we look at this division here, God's presence is still in the temple in Jerusalem. And God told his people, I don't want you worshiping anywhere you want. I want you to go to Jerusalem to worship. So Jeroboam says, well, now, if they start going down to Jerusalem to worship, they're going to say, well, let's just go back and let Rehoboam be our king too. So now, to counter that, he sets up these false gods at various places around Israel so that it's convenient for them to go and worship there. So let's see. Why is that important? Let's jump over to the New Testament, the book of John, chapter 4. This kind of will convey the same thing that we're talking about. So we're going to read verses this is where Jesus encounters the Samaritan woman at the well. And so he says, she comes to get water, and he says, well, I'll give you water, you'll never thirst again. And so he said, go call your husband and come back. She says, I have no husband. Jesus said to her, you are right when you say you have no husband. The fact is, you have had 5 husbands, and the man you now have is not your husband. What you have just said is quite true. Sir, the woman said, I can see that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain. So we're in Samaria. I'm not sure exactly which mountain this is. So we're in Samaria, which is in Israel. And he said, our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem. So, and when he encounters this woman in Samaria, she says, well, we worship here, but you say that we should go to Jerusalem. And Jesus goes on and going to say later on that there are other things associated with that. So, what happens over time, some of these Levites will migrate to Jerusalem. And so now we have this issue of we should worship in the southern kingdom, but we can't. So that brings us up to, again, kind of a recap here. The northern kingdom is 10 tribes, and there are some advantages to both of these areas. In the northern tribes, they have access that they can go trade with other nations a lot better than the southern kingdom can. It's more fertile. They can grow more crops in the north. You'll find out as you read through this that they actually have 3 different capitals. Shechem, Tirzah, and Samaria are capitals in the northern kingdom. The southern kingdom has the 2 tribes. The greatest strength they have is they control Jerusalem and the temple. And so there's constant strife from this division that Judah wants to try to force the northern 10 tribes to reunite. So you actually find out that there's fighting among the tribes of Israel over this contention. So as we go through this, it's kind of helpful to keep in mind what happens. During this period in history, different empires are powerful at different times. So we're going to read about the northern tribe of Israel being taken over by Assyria. So Assyria is going to take over the northern 10 tribes. When we get into studying in our next lesson, we're going to see that Babylon conquers conquers Assyria and the 2 southern tribes. So we're seeing a transition of power between Assyria and Babylon. Later on, Persia will overpower Babylon. And so we'll get into this too, but Persia takes this over, and King Cyrus comes in, and they have all these people that are being held captive, and he allows them to now return back to Jerusalem and rebuild. Later on, Greece will conquer all of that, and by Alexander the Great. And by the time you get into the New Testament, you're going to find out that Rome has conquered all of that territory. So as you go through reading biblical history, you kind of have to keep in mind, you say, what's the difference between Assyria and Babylon and Persia? They're actually about the same geographic area, but under control of different empires at different times. So here's what this looks like. So down here is Jerusalem. This is Samaria in the northern kingdom. And over here, this general area is called Assyria at this particular time. And you notice that there's two main rivers here, the Tigris and Euphrates River. There's actually 4 rivers there. But what does that look like now? So that same general area, here's where we were looking at before. All of that area now is primarily Iraq and Iran. The Persians primarily are in Iran, and there's a mixture over in Iraq. So the territory we're talking about is still in today's news. We've had wars in Iraq. There's a big threat from Iran. All of this is in the same geographic territory that we read about in the in the Old Testament when it relates to the nation of Israel. So I wanted to explain that to you. So now then we're going to go to 2 Kings chapter 17. So what's going to happen here, this is actually recorded in, remember we talked about Chronicles and Kings, and there's lots of different facts in each of those books. Some are the same story, some are different. So the fall of Israel, which is the northern kingdom, it's recorded in 1 Chronicles chapter 5 and 2 Kings chapter 17. So let's see, I think we want to read verses 1 through 7 of chapter 17. In the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, Hoshea, son of Elah, became king of Israel in Samaria, and he reigned 9 years. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, but not like the kings of Israel who preceded him. Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up to attack Hoshea, who had been Shalmaneser's vassal and paid him tribute. But the king of Assyria discovered that Hoshea was a traitor, for he had sent envoys to So, king of Egypt, and he no longer paid tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. Therefore, Shalmaneser seized him and put him in prison. The king of Assyria invaded the entire land, marched against Samaria, and laid siege on it for 3 years. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria and deported the Israelites to Assyria. And he settled them in Halah and Gozan and in Habor River and the towns of the Medes. All this took place because the Israelites had sinned against the Lord their God. So now let's jump over to verse 16 in that same chapter. They forsook all of the commands of the Lord their God and made for themselves 2 idols cast in the shape of calves and an Ashtoreth pole. They bowed down to all the starry hosts and they worshiped Baal. They sacrificed their sons and daughters in the fire. They practiced divination and sorcery and sold themselves to do evil in the eyes of the Lord, provoking them to anger. So, because, again, the northern tribes have gotten into this idol worship, even to the point of sacrificing their own sons and daughters in the fire. So God is fed up, and he allows Assyria to come in to capture the northern 10 tribes. And he carries them off. Let's jump over to, let's finish there in 16. 18. So the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them from his presence. Only the tribe of Judah was left, and even Judah did not keep the commands of the Lord their God. They followed the practices Israel had introduced. Therefore the Lord rejected all the people of Israel. He afflicted them and gave them into the hands of the plunderers until he thrust them from his presence. When he tore Israel away from the house of David, they made Jeroboam son of Nebat the king. Jeroboam enticed Israel away from following the Lord and caused them to commit a great sin. The Israelites persisted in all the sins of Jeroboam and did not turn away from them until the Lord removed them from his presence, as he had warned through the prophets, through the servants the prophets. So the people of Israel were taken from their homeland into exile in Assyria, and are still there. Now here's the interesting part. It helps you get a better perspective on some scripture. In verse 24 of chapter 17, the king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and settled them in the towns of Samaria to replace the Israelites. They took over Samaria and lived in towns. So, not only do they take a lot of Israelites over to another territory, they bring in people from other country to help populate Samaria. And they did that because as these nations grew, it became more and more difficult for them to control outlying territory. And there was always fear of rebellion. So they were fearful that whoever was left in there would rebel against them. So the king of Assyria brings in other nations, and they start intermarrying with the Jews, and you end up with what is known as a Samaritan. So a Samaritan is considered, we're not going to have time to get into this. So we just read, I think, 24, they bring in other nations, interbreed with the Jews, and now you have the Samaritans, and they are considered by many people, some people refer to Samaritans as half-breeds. They're not fully Jewish people because of what had happened here, which makes it, I think it helps you understand Jesus' parable about the Good Samaritan. That he's talking to the Jewish people, and he said, you know, there's this guy gets robbed, and he's by the side of the road. The Jewish people passed him by, but a good Samaritan stopped and took care of him. You can imagine what a shock that would be to the Jewish people. You mean a Samaritan is capable of doing something good? So that's kind of an interesting piece right there. I'm going to hand these out, and we're going to chat about them very quickly. You can take this with you. This is kind of a couple little charts that gives you kind of a graphic of how this all works out. We've got about 30 seconds to discuss this. But what you have there is, this is actually from a Bible teaching site. It's a whiteboard sketch of everything that we've talked about. And we'll get into more of this later on. So it's a good thing to kind of keep in mind visually how this all works out. But if you go to the second page, there's a good graphic that talks about the division of the kingdoms. So we'll talk about that briefly. At the top of the second page, it talks about the United Kingdom and the three kings of the United Kingdom. And then when it divides, on the left-hand side, it's going to talk about the Northern Kingdom. It's 10 tribes. The capital was Samaria. 19 kings reigned. You want to remember this as you go through this. It can get confusing when you're reading Old Testament history. Israel ends up with 19 kings. That's the Northern Kingdom. None of them were any good. They were all rotten kings. And when you get into the southern king, they ended up with 20 kings over their history. At least 7 were considered good kings in God's sight. Now, what's unique about that? All of the kings of the southern kingdom come from David's lineage. So David's descendants become kings, and 7 of them did okay, but all of them didn't. So when you start reading through, everybody says, oh, we're going to go to learn about the good kings, bad kings. Just remember this: Israel had no good kings. Judah had 7 good kings. When we next week we get together, we've talked about the fall of Israel today. Next time we get together, we're going to talk about what happens to Judah. They lasted longer. They hang on a few hundred years after Israel falls because of their attempt to be a godly nation. But we will see what happens is they end up going down the same path and idol worship and all of the things that the northern kingdoms did. And God says, okay, I got rid of the northern kingdom. And you're conducting yourself the same way. I'm going to allow you to be conquered too. You're going to be conquered by the Babylonians. Now the Babylonians are in power. So that's a lot to cover. Take that with you. We will not be here next week. And when we get back together, we're going to talk about the destruction of the city of Jerusalem and the downfall of Judah and how they are taken into captivity. Thank you for your time.